anything like me, you open TikTok daily to find that at least some of the content your For You page pushes out to you is about books. And I must hold my hands up and say, for the longest time, I disregarded books that were recommended on Booktok or Booktok books. Because I'll be honest, I thought they would be superficial or lack character development or have limited plots. Now, don't get me wrong, I am a girl that believes strongly that books can exist in mundanity. However, if there is limited plot, then I believe there must be complex and nuanced characters involved. Similarly, if you are writing characters that are essentially just stock characters, caricatures filled with stereotypes, you must be giving me the most interesting plot in the world. Otherwise, to me, it just feels a little bit like lazy writing, and unfortunately, that is the bias I used to approach Booktok books with. But for a while, I decided to really sit with these ideas and consider why I disregarded Booktok books so easily. Because it's not like I believe popular books are bad, nor that social media recommendations for books are bad. I've engaged with, consumed, and read books that's been recommended on booktube content for years, literally about half of my life. And I'm no stranger to going against intellectual snobbery in terms of the academic study of literature. I literally studied YA graphic novels for a literature degree dissertation. Over time, I began to realize that it is the tendency of Booktok and marketing that has emerged as a result to simplify books down to just the tropes involved with them, and that is what made me dubious of the recommendations. Rather than giving a synopsis, which I find a little bit more in depth and carries a little bit more of not just the vibe of the book, but the vibe of the writing style, instead, we're getting these short and sweet lists of tropes, which, don't get me wrong, they have their place. I mean, tropes are incredibly useful for identifying like books. Think the old school, if you like this book, you'll like this book type of content. However, instead of just recommending one book that's like one you've read, you can pull on any book you've encountered that carries that same trope to suggest whether you may enjoy engaging with a book or not. However, often there is limited supplementary content surrounding the plot of these books, which has wrongly led me to assume in the past that at best the works were superficial and at worst they contained bad writing. Now, for those of you who have seen my TikTok content, I no longer subscribe to this line of thought because I gave the books that I was seeing recommended on Booktok a go. That's not to say they're all gems or they'll all be for you, but they shouldn't be tarred with a blanket statement either. But a lot of the discourse I've seen surrounding tropes is that they are becoming a checklist for authors and publishers to fulfill because readers are recommending and taking recommendations based on tropes, which is advocating for lazy writing, focusing on adhering to tropes rather than creating innovative storylines that captivate and intrigue a reader. I have also seen, both in tandem and separate from this conversation surrounding tropes and Booktok books, conversations about how Booktok books and popular books on Booktok are contributing to a anti-intellectualism movement. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into all of these conversations happening, and I'm going to give a little bit of my opinion and my stance on them. Like I said, my stance has changed. I've given these books a chance, and I've viewed a lot of this content, so I feel I may be in a good position to at least weigh in a little bit here. But this video is meant to start a conversation because what I'm going to say is largely going to be based on my own thoughts and experiences and the specific books and content I've engaged with, which obviously is unique to my For You page and my algorithm. So I really want to encourage people to head down to the comments, share their thoughts, share their opinions, share their experiences with Booktok books. My only request is that you keep it respectful to each other and to me, please, guys. We can learn from different viewpoints and experiences, but only if we are open to listening to each other and sharing that respect and kindness. But with that being said, let's jump into the video. So I guess a good place to start would probably be to talk about what a trope actually is. So I found a thesis paper called Deconstructing Tropes in Popular Romance Fiction by Alyssa Palmer that defines it quite well. A trope is a plot device, theme, or character type that has been used so often as to become a convention of the genre. They aren't just used in romance fiction, but in most other genre fiction as well. There could be a misanthropic lone private investigator or cop trying to find a killer in a thriller, or in a superhero story there might be a villain who wants to take over the world. Tropes are familiar territory to readers and can offer them a starting point of interest in a story. And I think it's really important to note that Palmer says it's a starting point of interest, whereas I think perhaps we've snowballed past that in how we are utilizing tropes as recommendation points now. But as that definition kind of touches on, I'm not suggesting tropes are a new thing or they've been invented by Booktok. They've existed as long as genre fiction and the novel itself has. I mean, if you look at classic novels, you'll see elements of tropes within them. You could definitely call Pride and Prejudice the epitome of enemies to lovers. And for years, they have been part of how we recommend, pitch, and market books, even back to the Booktube days and even before that. Think about the popularity of the love triangle in the late 2000s and the 2010s. Think Twilight, The Hunger Games, The Vampire Diaries, or even more recently, where it still stands in things like The Summer I Turned Pretty or Stranger Things. I think it's evident to say that the love triangle is a pretty common trope when it comes to teen media in general, whether that be books or TV shows or films. Similarly, the craze for young adult dystopian led to a rise of books about these unassuming, ordinary girls turned revolutionary heroines. And for years, you've had the trope in dance movies of the boy from the wrong side of the tracks falls in love with the ballet dancer. So we find often media at the time engages with genre conventions or tropes to engage existent audiences. Like I noted, this has been seen before Booktok in booktube content, but also in those little reviews you'd see on the bookshelf by booksellers in Waterstones, or in how bookshops create table displays. But whittling down an entire book purely to its tropes and readers relying on tropes alone instead of plot to decide what book they're going to read next is something I've seen a rise of due to the popularity of Booktok. I've also seen a lot of people in this discussion touching on whether the types of books that are popular on Booktok, namely often the romance genre in its many forms, whether that be contemporary romance, dark romance, romantasy, but which have a largely female readership, are being noted as unliterary or anti-intellectual and reliant thus on tropes rather than plot. So what is this all about then? Well, first I want to speculate a little bit as to why we've made this shift from giving a detailed synopsis to just giving a list of tropes. Some of it can be seen to come from publishers. I mean, popular romance publishers such as Harlequin are known to focus on tropes to categorize the books that are pitched to them and to also rely quite heavily on this information when marketing these books. So it can't be a surprise that we've seen a rise in popularity of the books that are marketed in this way, as well as recommending in this way in the first place. I did start to wonder maybe it had something to do with shortened attention spans of people in the social media age, in the short form content era, but that's kind of a counterintuitive line of thought because reading in general is a hobby that requires dedication and time put into it and patience to get through a book. You are dedicating a considerable amount of hours to get through a book if you start reading one, especially because reading is not a passive hobby. It's something where you need to be focused on a story and its characters and its complexities. So I would argue that reading is not necessarily a hobby that attracts people with short attention spans in the first place. So perhaps it's not so much to do with the type of content we enjoy as consumers, but the type of content that the algorithm favors and thus pushes out to us. After all, recommending books in short, digestible phrases means that the video content itself is short and sweet, which often algorithms do favor. Similarly, tropes are easily hashtagable, which means they can easily be pushed to the people that engage with that type of content because it's flagged to do so. TikTok literally creates a built in audience for that trope based hashtag by understanding the tropes that users engage with the most. I mean, I can't be the only one that's followed the blue comment on a TikTok about a book I've seen, only to find that so many books with similar tropes then end up on my For You page. I particularly find this to be the case with tropes like found family, fake dating, and age gaps. But I find that this lumping together of arguably very different narratives based on base level tropes often means that I'm recommended books that I don't actually have much interest in because they share one trope with another book that I was interested in because the plot intrigued me. And this comes back to a personal gripe I have about recommending books purely on their tropes. When I'm recommending books, I want to know about the tension within the story. I want to know about the characters and how emotion is conveyed and the type of writing that is encompassed within it. I want to know about the pacing of the plot and the complexities or lack thereof of the interior worlds of our protagonists. I am first and foremost a character driven reader. I can read a character study with no plot if you have complex and nuanced characters, because it's the characters that we as readers connect to. It's the characters that invoke emotional responses from us and thus keep us engaged with the narrative that we're being told, even if it's the most mundane narrative to exist. That's not to say that I think all characters should be likable, but that is to say that I think character, far more than a specific trope or even genre, is what convinces me to read a book. It appears, however, others do not share this sentiment with me. You can even see this tropification bleeding into how authors talk about their own books. I've seen many authors promote new books by just posting an infographic that details the tropes involved in it, and not even in the caption is there a blurb about what the book is actually on. It seems almost like you have to put more effort in to actually learn what the substance of a book is, but the tropes of it you can find incredibly easily. And then I also see people in the comments of TikToks about a book asking whether specific tropes are present within it. I think it's clear to say that there has been a rise in how tropes are being used to market books, recommend books, and also just in how we're generally talking about books. But is that also affecting how books are being written and published? And are claims of anti intellectualism, in part, due to the rise of the use of tropes, rooted in some level of truth? Arguments of anti intellectualism, which come from intellectual snobbery, will often argue that things that are popular, things that have a mass appeal, are somehow intellectually less valuable. I mean, this is the age old difference between high culture versus popular culture. Often, what is popular is considered lowbrow, whilst that which requires certain criteria to access, maybe that's a certain level of education, maybe that's occupying a certain social class, social circles, or having a certain level of economic freedom. Those things will carry higher cultural capital and thus be seen as more valuable. Think about how going to the ballet at Christmas would be regarded as civilized and require an appreciation of culture, even though the Nutcracker is a children's story first and foremost. Whereas going to a pantomime, which is actually far more economically accessible to people, would be considered as frivolous entertainment. The same, perhaps, can be said for books. Whether in popular discourse or within academia, there's often this suggestion that to engage critically with books is more important than considering reading for enjoyment or entertainment, creating those two things as separate and dichotomous ventures. I argue we should attempt to bridge the gap between those two things, if for nothing more than the fact that we can learn so much about a culture and about a people by what they choose to engage with for enjoyment. After all, literature comes from a history of storytelling, which, yes, once upon a time it would have been used to share histories and folklore, but it also would have been used as a form of entertainment before streaming platforms and doom scrolling even was something people could conceive happening. And there is perhaps a case to be made that this pretentious need to separate the literature just from the books, as it were, calls back to the fact that originally only those who were wealthy, highly educated, and men were the ones who could read and engage with literature, thus decide what was worthy of study. So this suggests at least a history of social and intellectual hierarchy within reading itself. Now, I largely disregard the idea that something cannot be popular and intellectually valuable at the same time. First and foremost, something being popular does not negate it from holding studyable value. I mean, the books we choose to engage with tells us so much about social and cultural influences as pertains to certain reader demographics. Secondly, I like to actively disregard intellectual and academic snobbery in general because I did write a first class literature degree about YA graphic novels, young adult fiction, and so many people think young adult fiction is not worthy of study. It doesn't show anything about the grounding philosophies and ideals and morals for our society as children's literature does, and many would argue it can't be as complex as adult fiction. But I argue this dismissal of YA is not due to it being without merit, but due to it being a still relatively young genre, because the stage of life that is adolescence itself is actually still quite a new stage of life that developed between childhood and adulthood, largely post war. Thus, I argue in this case we are determining merit based on academic precedent that has not had time to develop yet. And I potentially argue this is also what we're doing with Booktok books, and perhaps our perceptions of this specific type of recommendation before giving the books themselves a shot. Because my issue personally is with the type of recommendations rather than the books themselves. Whereas I think often people look at the type of recommendation that's happening, focusing on these lists of tropes, and think it reflects the types of books being recommended. I suggest perhaps we can also see a similarity in Booktok in how genres are disregarded, because a lot of the content on Booktok speaks of romance books. So, romance as a genre, rather than just the romantic period, has often been disregarded as just chick lit or women's fiction, and has often been disregarded or relegated in academic and social discourse to being considered frivolous. And a large part of that is due to its primary readership and authorship these days being women. It is so often that we expect stories of women to simply just be for women, but we expect stories told about men to be universal. Because for the longest time, those who determined what was universal were men, because they were the only ones who were deciding what literature had value. After all, the unconscious social and cultural narrative is such that that which is considered high value or consistent with high culture is deemed as such by a society constructed by the patriarchy. So, are we claiming that romance novels and their tropified packaging on TikTok are anti intellectual not because they are without intellectual merit, but because they go against what has been conceived as high literature in the past? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming every book recommended on TikTok is a masterpiece, but I do think our tendency is to go too far in the other direction and tar all Booktok books with this preconceived notion of simplicity, without considering the complexities of social issues that can be addressed in the pages alongside romance. For example, Hannah Grace's Icebreaker, which is largely criticized for having too much sexual content, also explores in a really nuanced way this relationship between body image, sport, and food, which is a consistent and developed theme for Stacy's character alongside the romantic and sexual content. Thinking of this from the perspective of Booktok recommendations being disregarded, maybe in part because the primary audience and content creator demographic is women, we could also wonder whether this calls to the philosophical dichotomy that often referred to men as rational and women as emotional. I mean, this is the very argument that we use to keep women from academia, to stop women having the vote, and it's still the argument called on when women are regarded as too hysterical or asked whether it's that time of the month. My side note of interest here is that women are regarded as too irrational or feeling or led by emotion to have positions of power or leadership, yet they are the ones trusted to lead households and raise children who are the hope for the future, and thus who will transfer their traits to those children by being the primary caregiver, all whilst managing 1,000 spinning plates going at the same time. But it's okay, because that type of leadership is all about supporting and nurturing others. And also, whilst men are thought of as rational in this argument, for literal centuries, they have been encouraged to push away emotion but embody anger, which, last time I checked, was an emotion. And anger is a far more damaging emotional response than having a little cry and then letting the rational side of your brain kick in 5 minutes later. Now, obviously, that's a very simplified explanation of that line of thought, but I think it's a good perspective just to consider. And if you're interested more in that, I really encourage you to look into some philosophical theories regarding it and consider how that could apply to this kind of context. Now, some will argue that the amount of sexual content that is involved in some of these Booktok books is what comes into play when we're claiming anti-intellectualism. Although if you look at highly revered books like Lady Chatterley's Lover, which originally it was banned for showing sexual content and female pleasure, you will see that there are revered books that have always had an underlying tone of sexual content. And you have to wonder at what point this is being demonized, not because it's sexual content, but because it's being written for female readerships and thus the female fantasy rather than focusing male pleasure, which means there's a potential conversation to be had surrounding how we depict female sex, sexuality, and shame. And also, there's some books that are romance books which are highly revered in literature studies. Think, for example, a lot of Jane Austen's work. But even at the time, this type of literature and literature like it that has been lost to history would most likely have been devalued in the cultural zeitgeist as women's literature. So, is the reliance on tropes adding to this idea that romance books, books meant for a female audience, or popular books on social media are simplistic due to the simplified nature in which they are being recommended? Personally, my issue arises when tropes feel like they aren't just part of a book, but instead are tick boxes that an author and publisher strive to check off when they were publishing that book, prioritizing those marketable tropes rather than looking at nuanced and complex writing, stories, character. I do think there are some cases where we see this. A book is practically engineered to be recommended to the algorithm through tropes, and people see it and think, oh, it's a cute, fluffy romance, and so excuse things like poorly developed character or plot devices that aren't quite in conversation with the character's motivations, even leading to underdeveloped characters that feel like they are stereotypes strung together by the author, or a plot without tension that then leads to a third act romance that had no reason to occur within the emotional trajectory of the narrative for the reader. And this is my issue with the third act romance because rarely is it done well. So often there is tension that's lacking. It's not built effectively through the rest of the narrative. So this breakup feels like it comes completely out of left field. And there is rarely enough plot or pages left to fully rectify and resolve this issue. So it feels like it's a little moment of miscommunication or something along those lines that is so quickly rectified that we almost get emotional whiplash from it being shoved in the end 50 pages of a book. And the terrible knock on effect of that is often it feels like these characters that sometimes we have really well developed up to this point feel like they're completely different people out of the blue. Now, this is not to say that all books with tropes are marketing ploys. They aren't. As we touched on at the top of this video, tropes have been around as long as genre has. But I think there is something to be said on an over-reliance of them, which is diminishing the crux of storytelling. So I do think it's incredibly irresponsible to tar all books that are popular on Booktok, that get a lot of engagement from creators and users on there, as anti-intellectual. However, I do think we're entering a period where a balance needs to come about in terms of how we're marketing and talking about and recommending books. Because it is clear the publishing industry have found that popularity on Booktok is a way to invigorate the publishing industry, which it did desperately kind of need. And Booktok has been a real positive influence on getting more people to read and thus getting more money put into the publishing industry as a whole. However, a side effect we've seen of that already is that often authors are pushed to write another book, the next book in a series, and rush through it. And where the first one has been really popular and nuanced, people find that this new book feels rushed because the publishers want to profit off of the popularity as much as possible. Now, compared to something like BookTube or newspaper and journal reviews of books, Booktok is still really young. So I think both its influence on the industry and how it operates as a recommendation platform is evolving, and it will balance out eventually. But I think we've been in a period of extreme that does need to regress back to the mean. And potentially the harm of cashing in on the popularity found on Booktok by publishers is something we can consider going forward when we have these conversations about over reliance on tropes and speculating on anti intellectualism in Booktok books. The point of this video is not to produce answers. In fact, this video essay is significantly less researched than my video essays usually are, because this is essentially an opinion piece. This is a starting point of a conversation that I really want to engage with you guys. So let me know down below, what do you think of Booktok books? Do you read Booktok books? Have you ever been dubious of Booktok books? Is some of that because of tropes? Do you find tropes useful for recommending? Would you like to see more about plot and character in the recommendations you see on TikTok? And also, what's your view on this idea of anti-intellectualism? Is the argument of high culture versus popular culture and intellectual snobbery worth having here? Or is it just a fact of the matter that reading for entertainment and critically engaging with books can exist separately? Or is that in itself a dangerous argument because we ignore the social issues and depth of stories as a result? And do you think the over reliance on tropes and potential TikTok popularity is affecting the integrity of writing? I know I just rambled a whole load of questions at you, but I would love to know your thoughts and opinions. Don't feel restricted to what I've just asked, but I would love to hear other views on this conversation. After all, publishing as an industry is one that's always evolving because publishing has been around for so long. So, considering how Booktok influences publishing and influences the market, I think is really interesting to consider how current culture is evolving this long standing industry and how the industry will continue to shape culture going forward.